When Detective Smith was called backstage to investigate the Inwood murder, it looked like a rather routine affair. He hardly expected it to lead to the most dangerous adventure of his life, romance.
This is Foreign Correspondence, deeper into Hitchcock.
Welcome to the 36th episode of Foreign Correspondence, Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. My name is Michał Oleszczyk and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński. Hello.
Yes, and today we are continuing our mission to discuss every single Alfred Hitchcock film in chronological order. Last time we discussed a very strange and fascinating and problematic film that was Under Capricorn, and we were joined by Romanian film scholar Andrei Gorzo. And today we are about to discuss a film that probably is not beloved by any Hitchcock scholar, a transitional film in some ways, and a film that came really after a series of work that was perceived either as problematic or as lesser Hitchcock, like Under Capricorn, like Paradine Case, and in many quarters, like Rope as well. Stage Fright is the 1950 film that Alfred Hitchcock directed from a screenplay based on a story called Men Running by Selwyn Jepson. And it's a film that he made in Great Britain. In fact, the very first opening shot of the film takes us to London, to post-war London. So it's a return. It's also a film that returns to some tropes of Alfred Hitchcock's British oeuvre. And we will discuss it today with our fantastic guest. We are joined by Darragh O'Donoghue. Hello, Darragh.
Hello, Michael and Sebastian. How are you?
Wonderful. How are you?
Thank you.
Melting in the very, very, very hot London. 30 degrees we have here at the moment.
Well, Darragh is actually in London. He works as archive curator for Tate Modern, and he's also a wonderful contributor to Cineaste magazine, where he wrote about Stage Fright on the occasion of its Blu-ray release. The Blu-ray was released by Warner Archive. And this is actually a clue. This is a Warner picture. It was distributed by Warner Brothers. And we are looking forward to discussing Stage Fright with Darragh. Maybe first question, do you like the film? Are you fond of the film? It's not a film that's beloved by many. So what are your feelings towards this particular Hitchcock?
I'm very fond of it. I'm nearing beloved status, even since I read over my article last night and I realised I kind of hedged my bets a bit, but I think now if it's not a masterpiece, it's certainly one of Hitchcock's most enjoyable films. And I think it's his first go at North by Northwest, if you know what I mean. It's kind of his synoptic film, his looking back at his career and kind of looking back at his previous films and playing with them and taking them from different angles and so on. And it's got that joyous atmosphere that North by Northwest has, even though we're talking about murder. I don't know if this is the right time, but I was wondering if I could read something for you but this is a speech Hitchcock gave in 29th of April 1974 to the Film Society of Lincoln Center. So they had obviously given him some sort of award, and it looks like they gave him some sort of they showed a montage of some of his films, the way he refers to it. But I think it's very appropriate to Stage Fright, some of what he says.
Wonderful.
This was printed in Film Comment, by the way, in the July-August 1974, if anyone wants the citation. So he just goes, "Good evening. They say that when a man drowns, his entire life flashes before his eyes. I am indeed fortunate for having just had that same experience without even getting my feet wet. First of all, I wish to express my deep satisfaction for this honour. It makes me feel very proud indeed. As you will have seen, murder seems to be the prominent theme. As I do not approve of the current wave of violence that we see on our screens, I've always felt that murder should be treated delicately. In addition to that, with the help of television, murder should be brought into the home where it rightly belongs." It's fabulous. "Some of our most exquisite murders have been domestic, performed with tenderness in simple homely places like the kitchen table or the bathtub. Nothing is more revolting to my sense of decency than the underworld thug who is able to murder anyone, even people to whom he has not been properly introduced. Of course, this is only 2 years after Godfather, so... After all, I'm sure you would agree that murder can be so much more charming and enjoyable, even for the victim, if the surroundings are pleasant and the people involved are ladies and gentlemen like yourselves. Finally, I think I can best describe the insidious effect of murder on one's character by reading a paragraph from Thomas de Quincey's delightful essay, Murder as One of the Fine Arts. He said, "If once a man indulges himself in murder, very soon he comes to thinking little of robbing. And from robbing, he comes next to drinking and Sabbath breaking, and from that to incivility and procrastination. Once begun on this downward path, you never know where you are to stop. Many a man dates his ruin from some murder or other that perhaps he thought little of at the time. They tell me that a murder is committed every minute, so I don't want to waste any more of your time. I know you want to get to work. Thank you." So I think that touches on an awful lot, besides being just wonderful, it touches on an awful lot of what's going on in Hitchcock's work as a whole, but in Stage Fright as well. A lot of people make comments on how it's his return to England and his return to English, the films that he made, which were essentially comedies based on crime, if you like. Truffaut, who didn't admire, you're talking about people not admiring the film. Truffaut was one of them. He said it didn't add anything to his prestige, but he said it was an Agatha Christie type story, which I think exactly is what it is. It's what we today would call cozy crime, the sort of stuff, I don't know in Poland, but it certainly dominates British television. There's hundreds of these. And cozy crime is a very bizarre thing in that it centres on a murder, but the real interest in is it's usually set in a village, and it's got majors and matrons and dotty characters like that. So I think Hitchcock is playing with that kind of genre. He had adapted several of these authors, like Josephine Tay in Young and Innocent. She's one of the classics of that genre. You could call it cozy crime, you could call it the golden age detective fiction, which kind of flourished in between the wars. And actually, I think Young and Innocent is very much a film that he is working with in the Stage Fright. You've got a similar setup. It begins with a young woman breaking the law to help the man she loves. In her case, it's not a criminal, but she doesn't know that until near the very end. Whereas in Stage Fright, she thinks he's innocent and then discovers that he's a criminal. So it's kind of mirroring that. But it also has things like the set piece of the party. She goes to her aunt's house and does the party with the children, and that's expanded into this extraordinary set piece of the theatre fair, which culminates in a little boy, Boy Scout, coming up with the bloody dress, which is an extraordinary scene for so many reasons. That's one thing. Second thing is the Thomas Quincy reference. I mean, Hitchcock always liked to pretend, like so many of the Golden Age directors, that he wasn't a well-read man and that he was only a professional and he didn't watch films. And I think that De Quincey quote is a mark of actually his very deep intertextuality that goes on in all his films. So, for instance, the De Quincey quote comes from his famous essay called Murder is a Fine Art, which was structured as an address to an audience in a gentleman's club. So he's quoting this address to a gentleman's club in the Lincoln Center, who have come to pay homage to him. The film itself is full of references to his own films, such as Murder, one of his early talkies, which, of course, you've talked about. There's an awful lot of murder, for instance. It doesn't begin with the curtain rising, but it ends with the curtain. It ends with the detective, the actor who becomes a detective on stage, with the woman who's accused of murder and who's about to be hanged. And it ends up with them on stage performing, and the extraordinary shot in the middle of the film where we see the murder suspect in her cell, and where we see the prison bars, a curtain-like movement is made up. And it's the idea of the bloody dress, which is the guilty. So there's those sort of things. But there's also little nods to things like Foreign Correspondent with the amazing, there's a shot of all the umbrellas in the theatre, in the theatre party. But then there's Marlene Dietrich, for instance. You've got this amazing star, and almost every review you will read will say that this isn't really, that they didn't get on and it's not really the right vehicle. But one person did, which was Molly Haskell in Film Comment. And I agree with her that it's one of her greatest performances. But Hitchcock in the extraordinary last scenes where she's finally been caught out and she's sitting with the policeman, and she's talking about the story with the dog, and how the dog hated her and she kicked it and so on. And over from her character in her last film, which she played, which was A Foreign Affair with Billy Wilder, in which she played an ex-Nazi Chanteuse mistress. But also the way it's filmed, the backlighting behind her hair, the high angles, is so like as a tribute or satire of von Sternberg, whichever way you want to put it. So there's all this kind of going on. So whether you want to say that's just Hitchcock stretching himself or playing, and it's not serious in the way that Vertigo is serious, well, that's up to you. But it's certainly very enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Also, we are entering a decade of 1950s, which, as you mentioned, was a sort of a miraculous decade for Hitchcock. But I'm curious of what are Sebastian's impressions of the film?
Yeah, I would totally agree with Darragh that it's very enjoyable. It's like a trifle, but it has so many pleasures. Thank you for pointing out the Sternberg connection. I also had this feeling that this movie is pretty self-reflexive, and this is actually Christine Thompson's argument. She wrote about this film that stage fright is, and you can see that. You can see displayed this fun that Hitchcock has, not only with theatrical setting, obviously, which is in itself self-referential, but precisely with the image of Marlene Dietrich, or even his own career, his own 1930s movies, right, with their very British humor, which we as Polish viewers, I think it works strong on us. I mean, I think we sense immediately that we're in this London / English / British environment with all these incredibly juicy supporting characters, these great actors who have these very small parts, and it's all very funny, very light. I must say I misremembered this film, because of course when you go to Wikipedia you can read that this is 1950 British thriller film noir, right? But of course, as I think we could agree that the film noir ingredient or thriller ingredient is really small, right? I mean, in this sense that the protagonist is in peril only in the last sequence, right? For the rest of the movie, she's more of a sleuth, trying to understand the situation, maybe risking her reputation and risking being exposed, but not really risking her life, right? So I would say it's closer to comedy, and I like that a lot, because recently I'm thinking more and more about Hitchcock as a comedian, as a director of comedies. And even recently, like 2 weeks ago, Michał was presenting in one of Polish theaters, Rear Window, introducing this movie, and there was this wonderful conversation with the audience at the end. I think we were discussing this idea of Hitchcock as a great director of comedy, which is not that popular in Poland, right? I think you, Darragh, you may perceive Hitchcock more in that vein because, you know, of your British identity, right? Irish identity. So
Gotta be careful there.
yeah, I know. Yes,
I'm joking.
No, that's fine. And you know, Charles Barris set out to discover Hitchcock's Irish roots, right? Which is still a topic to examine, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. We lived on the east coast of Ireland, which means we got all the British television channels. So we saw not just all the Hitchcocks, but all. And it's a context I think I'm surprised it's not really ever put in, but I think it really should be considered part of that, because it's right slap bang in the middle of the Ealing comedy series, and in the exact same year that Stage Fright came out, a film called The Happiest Days of Our Life came out, which starred people like Alistair Sim and Joyce Grenfell, but also it was made and produced and written by Launder and Gilliatt, who of course wrote The Lady Vanishes. And although I'm kind of contradicting myself here, I just quoted Hitchcock, but it is very dangerous to take what he takes seriously, and you should always take, or literally, you should always take the context into account. And I feel that, for instance, the Truffaut book, although it's amazing for a lot of reasons, I think for some reason he feels inferior, and he's often agreeing with what Truffaut says. He never contradicts Truffaut. So if Truffaut starts talking about all the bad things, so he says things like Alistair Sim, you know, he didn't like him, and whereas Alistair Sim is just extraordinary. And I'm delighted you said that you loved the English comedy aspect, because Molly Haskell's view is really get it was they didn't understand the nuance of language, but I don't think that can be true, because Alistair Sim has got such an amazing physical presence as well. I mean, he's like a skeleton. He's got this ghoulish face, but I think that is one context that would be very useful to kind of slot. I don't completely agree that it doesn't have darkness in it. I think, first of all, the flashback, whatever you think of its status, just as a piece of filmmaking, I think it points forward to so many. I mentioned in the review that it points forward to things like Vertigo, just the idea of the gaps in the narrative, but the way it's filmed and so on. And then that final scene, I found it really astonishing, or the climactic scene where they're both hiding, Jane Wyman and you just see their eyes lit. I find that really haunting, and maybe it is my Irish Catholic thing, but I find there's a real, because she's crying, and I know she's been crying earlier, but there's a real feeling that she is seeing somebody who's just lost his soul. Half of his soul is draining away, and she's kind of crying for that. That might be ridiculous and over the top, but I find it incredibly moving. I think she's amazing, by the way. I know a lot of people say Jane Wyman, it doesn't suit the film. I just think she's extraordinary in it. I think he should have made more films with people like her than some of the cool blondes he did, but that's a personal taste.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned The Happiest Days of Our Life, because that's one of Terence Davis's favorite films, and another favorite, because when I was watching Stage Fright now, and I haven't seen it in 25 years. That was the first time I saw it, was about 25 years ago on Polish television. Now I watched this Blu-ray, and in the meantime I became enamored of E-Link comedies, and of course there are casting nods to those comedies here in the person of Alistair Sim, but also this wonderful small bit part by Joyce Grenfell, whom, as you mentioned, was in those comedies as well. But of course E-Link has also this dark underpinning of black comedy. I would say some of the blackest, some of the most immoral in Kind Hearts and Coronets, which is only 1 year before this film. It's 1949, the Robert Hammer film, which is delightfully heartless, I would say. And for me, I would like to inquire, what sentiment do you think Hitchcock evokes in this initial raising of the curtain on London, on post-war London? We know that when he was leaving England, even people close to him, like producer Michael Balcon, really criticized him heavily for leaving at a crucial time in the nation's history. Now it's post-war, it's in fact Cold War. There is even a reference to Russians in the dialogue. The maid says, "Give me the Russians." Like Russians would be better than this inquiring by the police. And I would just like to ask: do you feel that we can discern what kind of a note Hitchcock is striking as a homecoming film, let's say? What kind of a London is he finding in this movie? Is he triumphant in his comeback, or maybe he's a tad modest, or maybe even apprehensive in, re-entering the scene, as it were? What is your feeling? How is Hitchcock settling in London before his later comebacks, of course, like Frenzy, but that will be 20 years later. But here, what do you think Hitchcock is feeling when he's showing us this first spectacular shot of London?
I think the first thing to say is it's not really his first, in the sense that it's not that he hasn't been back. I mean, he made those propaganda films, Bon Voyage and Aventure Malgache, and he was involved in the concentration camp film. And I think under Capricorn was some of it was filmed in England, so he'd always been going back and forth.
Right, but it was set in Australia, right? So but the setting here is London.
But the Paradine case was set in UK, right?
The Paradine case, right, with Charles Lofton, right.
But I know what you mean. I mean, first of all, Hitchcock always relented the fact that the English never took him seriously. And that's right up. The French had recuperated him as a master. I mean, even up to the 60s. You have Robin Wood in 1966, is that 66, 67 when his book comes out? And he's talking about sight and sound and their kind of condescending attitude to Hitchcock. So, I mean, there's that kind of fearfulness. There's the rise of neo-realism. And I always think of that opening as kind of a joke, because he'd just been working in a number of films with Ingrid Bergman, and then she'd got off with Roberto Rossellini, and the first thing you get is just completely artificial safety curtain. And safety curtain's hilarious, because what's that there is to stop a fire happening in the theatre, and of course we're going to watch a play where we hope there's going to be some sort of London. It's not the touristy, I mean, it is touristy, it's St. Paul's, but it's a bombed out part of London, because right up until the 60s, London was still full. I mean, it didn't really start developing until the 1980s. So you would see bombed out remains all around there. But St. Paul's was particularly targeted by Hitler, by the Nazis, because it was such a symbol of England and London and London resistance to the Blitz. And Churchill had said, you know, whatever about anywhere else, we are going to protect St. Paul's. So you get this image, and it looks like it's a neo-realist kind of image, like, you know, Germany Year Zero or something. But instead, you get right into what you call it in medias res. You get this car to a great Hollywood star and a great English theatre star and thing, and they're in the middle of a plot. So you get this disjunction. A lot of the reviews and writings about it talk about that the film deliberately at this moment is announcing its artificiality, and I'm not sure. I think it's showing what's the word I'm looking for? That they're adjacent to reality and fiction and fantasy. And if you want to get all kind of moral and Robin Hood about it, which I'd like to do, this is what Jane Wyman's character has to learn in the film. That it's kind of, because the film begins with her being told a lie and she believing it, and the whole film up until the last 10 minutes is based on her believing a fake story. So she, in effect, is learning to see between reality and fiction. I think that's what Hitchcock is doing in that side. But I agree with you that he must have been feeling very, I mean, the fact that he was making a film in England at all, the fact that after a number of these experimental films that, I don't know, I think Capricorn is one of his masterpieces, and Rope is quite amazing as well. But, you know, they were badly received by and large, by critics, by audiences. He must have been wondering where his career was going. A bit like Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was kind of floundering a bit as well. And of course, we have the Paramount decree just 2 years earlier. And so the studio is in flummox. And you were talking about earlier about the reputation of stage fright. It was actually the very last Hitchcock film I ever saw, you know, in collecting. It was very hard to see. It was never shown on British television, where I used to see all the Hitchcocks on British television Saturday afternoons and things like that, or on bank holidays. And that was one that was never shown. And I thought it might have been something to do with rights or something, but it can't, because it's Warner Brothers. So I've always wondered why it almost became a film maudit, but there's no real reason for that. It's appropriate in the sense that it's almost a bit lost, and you have these characters who are a bit lost. And Hitchcock is floundering a bit, and he's trying his hand at these various. You could talk that these, I don't agree, but there are jarring, you know, you go from murder and high comedy and Ealing and Sternberg and stuff. You could argue that this is somebody trying a lot of styles because he's kind of lost his way. You know, again, I don't agree, but in 1950, it must have looked that way. Sight and Sound certainly said that. They said, you know, after 3 or 4 flops, it looks like this is the end for Hitchcock, you know. And in hindsight, we can laugh at that, but it must have looked like that in 1950.
Right, right.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. And I think also another thing that strikes me about it is that it's a film about acting, and it's a film about directing. Eve, the character played by Jane Wyman, is an aspiring actress, like Hitchcock's daughter, by the way, who is in the film, Patricia Hitchcock. And we could go into quite a rabbit hole, I think, you know, analyzing the implications of the father-daughter relationship on the set. The character is called Chubby, by the way, and in the film, because Alistair Sim is, of course, Jane Wyman's father in the film. And as you mentioned, and I would like to quote this sentence from your piece in Cineaste about the scene in which we have the blood-smeared doll during the fair, and I have to quote this. Gill, who won a doll to use as a prop to confront a 50-year-old chanteuse with her alleged crime, cuts his own hand with a penknife to smear blood on the toy infant's dress. It is a symbolically loaded scene that is too disturbing in its thematic implications to think about for long. And I wanted actually us to delve into that scene a little bit, because it is. But what are we to make of this strange moment with the bloodied doll being exposed almost obscenely to Marlene Dietrich. Sebastian, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, thank you for reading that sentence. I also singled it out in my notes because I loved it. It's precisely the level of fun and restraint in that sentence is like pure Hitchcock, if I may say so. So thank you.
But the scene is like from John Waters, you know?
The scene is crazy. It's also the only moment, narratively speaking, when the movie decidedly tells you, now I want to focus on this guy. And as you write, Darragh, you write that Alistair Sim is the heart and soul of the movie, right? But this is the moment when totally the camera is focused on him for several minutes, and it's a crazy scene. Also, first time in my life as a Hitchcock watcher, let's say, I had this uncanny feeling looking at the way she's framed. The camera stands in one of the shots just in front of her, so we get her full frontal, let's say, her face frontally. We see her frontally, and she looks precisely like a mix of Hitchcock and Alma, which genetically she was. But it was very uncanny for me, and I started to think about this uncanny effect, which is also explored later on in Strangers on a Train, right? When she also has this, she gets to be strangled by Guy for a moment, right? So that was pretty strange. And of course, what is interesting for me, and I wonder what Darragh thinks about it, is the lovely portrait of the father, that it's a really lovely relationship full of tenderness. Maybe you could read Freudian implications into that, but the way it's presented on the surface, it's really one of the most sympathetic duos of a child and a parent in Hitchcock's ever. So I found it very, let's say, interesting and inspiring.
I think so. I think it's an incredibly warm, but I think they're both warm actors. Again, you might think that's unusual for Hitchcock, but maybe that's why he didn't rate as much. But they're definitely warm. When I was thinking about why that scene is so troubling or disturbing, as well as being hilarious, like so much of the film. I mean, first of all, it's linking with that opening flashback. And Marlene Dietrich's introduction. It's not an introduction to Marlene Dietrich's face, it's an introduction to her dress and her legs. And a reference to, in her films, it was always her legs. That was always the first thing that was shown. And if you read any of the biographies, she was always showing them off in various situations. So there's a link to that. At the risk of, again, going into interpretive delirium, the main character, Jane Wyman's character, is called Eve. And I don't know, does that make her father God? But it's certainly, there's some sort of menstrual idea, this idea that this is not just a particular woman, but all women. There's a funny joke where she's talking with, she still hasn't revealed herself to the Michael Wilding, the detective. And he says, she says, oh, I'm an actress, and have I seen you in anything? And she said, oh no, I was the fourth deadly sin. And of course, the fourth deadly sin is envy. And it's so much of the film, you could argue, is about her envy of Marlene Dietrich and her attempt to put her down to size, whether you agree with that or not. But there are these kind of mythical undertones, I think, religious undertones. And then there's the idea that he's giving this doll, which is now covered in blood, which is a symbol of this transgressive relationship, which is the Richard Todd and Marlene Dietrich. She's an older woman, she's a married woman, and he gives it to a Boy Scout. And the Boy Scouts, of course, is supposed to be all about, keeping on the moral straight and narrow. There's a religious basis with the Church of England. Obviously, he's a boy, he's prepubescent, he shouldn't know any of this weird stuff. And yet, Alistair Sim, he almost chucks him into this moral, and of course, as you mentioned earlier, it's all about acting and staging. I mean, she's on stage. He is going from being a Boy Scout. I mean, he's in a uniform, so there's an element of performance about it. But he's been thrust onto the stage, and he hesitates on the stage. And Alistair Sim kind of encourages him on like a parent, at a school play. There's all these elements in it. That's kind of what I was trying to get at in. They're troubling. I mean, there's elements of paedophilia if you want to even go that far. So, these are all at play. It's like Hitchcock has created all these strands in the movie, and this is where they all come together with a vengeance. And just to add to what you were talking about, his weird relationship with his daughter, I'm sure you looked at the documentary that was accompanies the Blu-ray, and she tells us that it wasn't Jane Wyman who's driving in the car at the beginning, because Hitchcock didn't want Jane Wyman to get hurt, but he didn't mind her, so it's her it's her doing the stunt driving. I thought that was hilarious, but she seemed very fond of him, and of course she was a student in RADA at the time, so
Yes,
Jane
and
Wyman's effectively playing her. I mean, not age-wise, but she's effectively playing a character like her.
yes, but that sentence is jarring when she says, yes, of course he wanted to protect her, so I did it. So, and she says she loved it. And she's not, she looks quite similar. I mean, there's something in Jane Wyman that approximates the look of Patricia Hitchcock. Also, the first sentence that Jane Wyman's character Eve finishes in her first scene when she's playing the dialogue on the stage. She says something about marriage would be an impossibility. and I thought immediately that this is the movie maybe about the impossibility of marriage, because she's already married to her father in a way, because he's the perfect partner. He's funny, he sees through Jonathan Cooper, the Richard Todd character, so it's a layer cake with many layers. Also the scene with the doll, it's so obscenely, grotesquely funny that it almost feels like one of those famed jokes that Hitchcock was doing to his cast members. We know that he gave to Melanie Griffith. He gave when she was a girl. He gave her a small coffin with a doll of Tippi Hedren, of her mother, right? So this feels a little bit like this kind of sick joke, that there's this bloodied doll, menstruating doll, something like from that. Let's say repertoire, but I need to ask you both about one thing that I think for today's audience, for example, to audience of my students, would be, I think, the most shocking aspect of this film. And it's not the bloodied doll. It's this notion that Eve is standing by her man. I mean, the Jonathan Cooper, despite, I know she knows of his innocence, but he's bluntly stating to her that he's in love with this other woman, Marlene Dietrich, and yet, Eve says in the car, "Oh, I guess I need to learn how to play second fiddle," and then she brings the guy to her father's house, and they basically working very hard, to clear him of any accusations. The alternate title of the film could be "Stand by Your Man." Basically, she's completely willing to accept him because she's so fond of him, even though he gets her into a really, really dangerous situation. What did you make of this relationship? Are they a couple, or are they very close friends? What did you think, Sebastian?
The first sentence that Richard Todd characters when the flashback ends is, "Do you hate me now?" Which is which sets the tone of this relationship. What kind of a question is that in a 1950 movie, right? I would say, I'm continuing your
he says to her, "Good old Eve."
Yeah, exactly. So, but in a way, it's a very modern sentence. I don't know. I have a feeling it's like a social media era question. Do you hate me now, right? Well, when we are so exposed and everything. So I don't know. I think it's something I struggled with to understand. Are they a couple? Not, of course, not obviously, but why not? Because of the production code, or because of some holes in the plot, or whatever? Do they just like each other? But obviously, if he's asking that kind of question, then he knows that she's in a way fascinated by him or likes him a lot, and so on. So I just think it may be a structural flaw on one side, also because when you read the history of the production of this movie, the script was in a constant flux because of the power balance on the set, right? So Marlene Dietrich taking care of herself, like these famous quotes from Hitchcock, and I think we still don't know if it was meant to be ironic or not, that she's a real professional, she's the best cameraman, best dresser, and so on. So showing, kind of reflecting her influence on the look of the film, like Christian Dior costumes, obligatory in the contract and stuff like that. So she was a powerful persona, but Hitchcock liked her because he was more satisfied with her as a performer than Jane Wyman, right? And thanks to some kind of a romantic affair that Dietrich had with Michael Wilding, supposedly his part grew bigger, right? Right on the set, and there were several screenwriters. So all these entanglements made Richard Todd's character smaller, and this part of the plot smaller. So maybe on one level it doesn't really matter what the relationship is. Because he's kind of a MacGuffin at the end, right? I agree with Darragh. Darragh mentioned this amazing scene at the end when they are sitting together in this like theatrical carriage of sorts, right, or something like that. And I think it's a very powerful scene because of this moment of recognition of pathological character, of a murderer, of a psychopath of sorts, right? I think it's a very powerful moment, very 1950s Hitchcock in many ways. But that's the moment when he comes back, but throughout the movie he's kind of off the picture. So I would say, I don't know, that's the way I read it, as a kind of like a structural flaw, or like the structural reshuffling of characters.
What's your take, Darragh?
I have to say, I profoundly disagree with you, Mikhail. I think one of the reasons Eric Romer, for instance, loved Hitchcock was because he gave him a pointer to his own career, and that was the difference between what is said on the script level and what is shown visually, or what characters do. And I think that's something that's key to Hitchcock. And although Eve might say these what seem to be self-abnegating or sexist things, at every point in the film, she does what she wants. She leads. She ignores any advice from her father, from the men in her life. When she finally decides on Michael Wilding, it's directly on her terms. It's her we see. When we see the piano that he's just been playing, we see it silent, but we hear the music that he's been playing going off in her head. So it's given from her point of view. I agree it might be bad writing or writing influx. I think it's part of this idea of something she has to learn, that she has this infatuation with Jonathan that she has to learn is bad. But I think there's a moral element to it, and that not only does she learn what Jonathan is and learn the values that he represents, because it's not just that he's having this affair. I mean, he's materially benefiting from it. He seems to be a second in command, but he's got a great flat and a very, as somebody who lives in a cubby hole in London and paying a fortune for it, I know that he must be paying a fortune for where he is living in London. The photograph we see of him with Marlene Dietrich, he's staring directly at her. And it doesn't look like a man who's infatuated. It looks like a man who's seeing what he can make of it. So I think this is something that she doesn't learn. Whether she's infatuated or just in love, but she learns what these values are, and she learns to reject them and to accept. That does sound simplistic as I say it, but I think there is this moral. As you can tell, I'm probably more on the Robin Wood side of the Hitchcock. I do think he's a healthy moralist as well as a weirdo man. So I think Richard Todd almost, if you take the idea that Eve isn't just an accidental name, that he's almost like the snake. And if you think of the tree of knowledge that Eve isn't allowed to take, and he's giving her the tree of false knowledge, and the apple that he gives her, if you like, is false knowledge, and she must learn to reject this apple, if you like. I don't want to go say, I'm not going with Chabrol and Romer that Hitchcock was this Catholic apologist or whatever, but I do think it is definitely an element. It's something, you know this yourselves as Poles. This is something we, as Irish, we grow up with as part of our baggage. And even if we're not consciously going out trying to find Catholic symbols and everything, it's just something we grew up with. It's a way of seeing the world, and you have to actively reject it. You're still engaging with it.
I like the poisoned apple idea that you mentioned, or the apple of knowledge that Hitchcock slips sort of and gives Eve. But he also, and this is probably something that we have to discuss, the chief point of discussion in this film, he also hands us this apple in the form of a false flashback. And this is something that I would like to culminate our conversation with, is the false flashback. Because he also gives us this apple to bite, and we bite into it because we don't know, we don't assume. I bit into it the second time I watched the film because, I watched it after 25 years, so I didn't remember that there was a false flashback. And there's something about the swiftness of the sequence, Marlene Dietrich walks right in, and right off the bat, we have this bloody dress. And she says, Johnny, do you love me? Say you that you love me. Will you do this for me? And he doesn't think, he just does it. You pointed out in your article to some interesting matte shots that are used in this film, that in the sequence, that makes it look quite weird. But this is something that I would like us to discuss sort of as the culmination of the episode. What do you think of this false flashback that Hitchcock, perhaps honestly or perhaps disingenuously, called a mistake? He said it was a mistake to include this unreliable narrator in his film. What are your takes, Sebastian?
Yeah, I think, again, agree with Darragh, what you said about the Hitchcock Truffaut book. As we're revisiting Hitchcock, I have the same feeling that, as you said, Hitchcock doesn't contradict him, and he's too submissive, to some of his claims, which I find really puzzling, really puzzling. The example you gave with Alistair Sim, but also many others. So in this case, I don't consider, for example, Hitchcock Truffaut book as the source of what really Master thought, right? Because of course we know that Hitchcock as a persona was multi-layered and having fun with us and so on. So I honestly, I don't think he would nowadays he would say that it was a mistake, and I don't think it was a mistake at all, because how Michał described the sequence, it's purely oniric. It could be described as a classic Hitchcock dream sequence. Maybe this is precisely the dream sequence that he should have done in Spellbound, right? Which the sequence which finally just consisted of several shots, but here I counted it's 13 minutes. It's a long scene, so part of the fun is that after, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes, you tend to forget that it's a flashback. Obviously, that's how flashbacks work, like this long flashbacks in so many movies. You just forget it's narrative with a narrative. But what I found really fascinating, and I think rarely commented, is that at one point when Richard Todd character is trying to scheme, he has this, so we are within a flashback, and then within that flashback he has this fantasy or his anxious thoughts, what will happen, and we have like another layer, another level of his obsessive fantasy nightmare thoughts. So I think it's pretty interesting, and I think it works really well in this film. I mean, I would say maybe on a formal level it's the most appealing part, precisely because of the swiftness and because of the number of improbabilities, right? He's just entering this house, which I'm referring to the scene when he's going to take the dress for Marlene Dietrich character. He's entering this house, and we have this great shot that recently Mark Cousins was describing in his movie on Hitchcock, when the camera is following him, and apparently the front of the house was just a piece of set design, and we are following him, through the door, and it's very oniric. Then there is this absurd chase, that these men in suits, these policemen, are trying to chase him. So I don't know. I think it's very interesting, and I think people who say that it should not have been there or that it's a mistake, of course, it's a way to judge Hitchcock from this perspective of Hitchcock the entertainer, right? That he entertained us in a maybe wrong way, dishonest way, but I'm closer to folks who say that it's pre-Rashomon device. I like it. I think it's a very, very stimulating moment in a movie which has more such moments, such crazy moments, as we've discussed, the one with the doll. But basically, all Marlene Dietrich scenes are very foggy, I would say, or they have this hazy quality, which I like in Hitchcock in general.
Mm-hmm. What's your take, Darragh?
Well, I think the first thing to say is people assume that the audience is watching Stage Fright who saw the flashback were seeing this material for the first time. And of course, like today, before they went to see Stage Fright, they saw the trailer, which is included on the disc. It's very interesting. You could say that, oh yeah, you can only notice it with the knowledge of the revelations after you've seen the film. But it's very interesting if you look at the trailer. You know, there's this kind of patter where they're saying curious busybody and so on, and it says a suspicious body, and it's written on screen, and it's Richard Todd pulling across the curtains, which is in the flashback. So even if you don't make a conscious reference, you will have seen an image of Richard Todd behave and the word suspicious in the trailer. And then finally, it also says this story, and it goes something like that led to a front page murder, and it's the scene of Richard Todd and Jane Wyman, the one we talked about at the end in the kind of prop store, I think it is. So from the beginning, we know how much control Hitchcock had on his ads. It was all part of his engagement with audiences. I don't think he's ever trying to fool audiences. I think he's always trying. I think he's one of these directors like Buñuel and Lang who exist to engage his audiences, and that's why the point of view is so important for Hitchcock. I think it's a magnificent sequence. Whether you think it's a cheat, but I don't think it is a cheat. For a start, it's not unprecedented. I mean, Laura, which again was discussed by Kristen Thompson, is essentially a one whole long false flashback, and the narrator is like the whole film is narrated by the killer. So you can say that the Hitchcock is only synopsizing the technique of Laura. He would do it again. So if he thought it was a mistake, he does it in I Confess, for instance. Anne Baxter's flashback is full of things that are later shown not to be true. And again, I don't think it is false. I mean, I won't go as far as Chabrol and Romer, who said, if you turn down the sound, it's actually a true flashback. That's not quite true. But I do think there's a lot of truth in the flashback. For instance, there are most of the long shots in the film, long takes in the film. There are about 4 or 5 in the flashback that last longer than 1 or 2 minutes, which is uncomfortable for an audience, especially in a trailer that has started with such excitement with the car journey. Richard Todd does not look like somebody who is frantic and innocent. He actually looks quite sinister throughout the whole thing. The way he looks, the way he surveys the crime scene, the way he pretends that a robber has broken into the office, and the way he looks then at the Kay Walsh character. All these things, I think, we know from critics. I would love to know. We never get kind of audience response. I'd love to know what audience thinks. We only get critics' responses. I'd love to know if anyone took, you know what they call market research at the time. You know, these focus groups that we get. I'd love to know what audiences thought.
Gallup polls.
Gallup polls. I would love to know. Because I didn't feel cheated. Did you feel cheated the first time you saw it?
No. And besides, you know, to put a film historian hat for a second, I would say, you know, this is a Warner Brothers picture. They did those polls at that time. If something was really perplexing for an audience, they would cut it because you know it would have been indicated in those cards. You know, that's how they got rid of the famous initial sequence of Sunset Boulevard, for example, the same year that was Paramount, but the cards said it's unacceptable, so they ditched it.
And they mentioned it in Sunset Boulevard. They say this won't play in Pomona or something. This is very much something. Yeah, exactly. I agree.
So they wouldn't let this slip by. If it. So I think it's a film that makes sense when you watch it. You watch it. Of course, it's a prank. It's a ruse. You fall into it because you are supposed to fall into it, but then you get out of it just as the narrative pulls you out of it. So I think it works.
And it's also part of the genre that he's working with, this English cozy crime or golden age detective. This is something they do all the time. So readers are not surprised. They actually hope for it. It's kind of this battle of wills. Will I guess the right criminal? And then you're completely foxed, and then you go back and you realize how the writer or the director in this case has fooled you, and that's part of the pleasure of it. It's the genre that he's working in. It's one of the problems of just looking in auteur terms. You have to look at the wider context. We talked about Ealing earlier, but you also have to talk about the literature of the time, and because we've forgotten a lot of these books. A lot of these now haven't been reprinted, and stuff. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, so Darragh, my final question about precisely that literary genre, because it's common knowledge that Hitchcock didn't like whodunits. I hope I'm not mistaken, but you rarely speak about Agatha Christie and Alfred Hitchcock together, right? Am I right? The genre you're talking about is kind of like Agatha Christie genre of this like cozy English mystery story.
Was Hitchcock a fan of her?
In a bit like Hitchcock in the 50s, she's been reevaluated as somebody who's more than an entertainer, who dealt with really complex issues of class and gender, and a changing London. So her stock has certainly gone up very high, and often they will use, academics will use the comparison with Hitchcock. So that obviously hasn't travelled further outside, but definitely that genre, rather in the same way maybe as the thriller, isn't necessarily treated as high-mindedly in the way that Hitchcock is. I think that genre is patronised as just some entertainment. You'd read it in a week as light entertainment. Michael Wilding, I think one of the reasons he's in there is he had played a number of detectives. For instance, he played in Trent's Last Case a couple of years before the film, which is one of the key Golden Age films. But I don't think you even know when you're watching stage Fright that it is a whodunit. If you have fallen for the flashback, you assume that he is the innocent man, like Roger Thornhill or something. It's only at the end that you realise that it has been a whodunit. So I think he's playing with that. It's the idea of knowledge, of who holds the knowledge, and how should we interpret what knowledge or what information or what narratives are being given to us. I think that's what's going on. We do, it even goes down to genre. We don't even know what genre we're watching until the last 10 minutes, almost.
Absolutely, and I would say that even in Psycho, the shower scene is a false, because we are supposed to think that the mother did it, right? We see a woman figure killing, and we are supposed to think, oh, Norman is cleaning up, after her. So Hitchcock he knew what he was doing. He was playing with this.
And of course, it's lovely to see that in Stage Fright, there's a character called Sergeant Loomis talking of Psycho. And I'm sure that's a coincidence, but it's nice for Hitchcockians to embrace these things.
Well, I feel satisfied, and I feel that this conversation really expanded my understanding of and pleasure of this film, which I still would say it's not a great Hitchcock film, but I think it's a very good and interesting Hitchcock film with many avenues to explore. So I'm very much satisfied, and we would like to thank you so much for joining us. And please tell us, what's your favorite Hitchcock film? I was wondering, which one do you think is really the richest, and which one you think is the Hitchcock masterpiece, since we are entering this golden decade of Hitchcock?
Well, it's really, really boring, but it's always been Vertigo. And recent years, Under Capricorn has really kind of risen up. I really love Under Capricorn.
Why?
I think the long takes are not just a technical exercise. I think they are emotionally driven, and they force the audience into the emotions. All his best films, technique is always at the service of emotions and character, perspective and enlightenment, and so on. I think it really works. But I agree, you have to be patient. I've shown it to other people who really hate it. And it's got Ingrid Bergman in it. I know that's terrible and outdated, but
We know exactly what you mean. Darragh, this was a pleasure and a fascinating talk. Thank you so much for saying yes to this. Thank you for your wonderful writings. We encourage our listeners to seek out Darragh's great contributions to Cineaste magazine. And hopefully, because you also are almost regular guest at Gdynia Film Festival in Poland. Hopefully we will see you there at some junction. So thank you so much for spending time with us discussing Stage Fright.
Well, thank you both so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Don't get to talk about Hitchcock half enough, so thank you.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to talk to Darragh. He's really, and I meant it. You really should seek out his pieces. He's a fantastic writer. In the next to last issue of Cineaste, he had this great essay on RRR, which only shows you the scope of his cinephilia and expertise. It was a great adventure. So, are you ranking Stage Fright high or low in your Hitchcock pantheon?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like 36th episode. So many great movies. A few lesser ones, less fascinating. But I was really surprised because somehow I remember this movie precisely as a thriller. I thought, oh, there would be some dark mystery as far as I remembered. But no, it was a pretty light comedy, but I think we didn't mention that, but I think pretty smart at certain moments. Some of the scenes, conversations, the theme of impersonation and changing costumes, identity, I think it's pretty pretty smooth, sleek, and I agree with Darragh that there is this taste of just a taste of North by Northwest and this kind of fun and play, and also the again, I would agree with Darragh, this self-consciousness on Hitchcock's part. All these shots with the stairs at the beginning in this flashback. The stairs, these Hitchcockian motifs, the curtains. Because also at the beginning of the flashback, Marlene Dietrich asks the character, "Oh, close the curtains." Like 2 minutes after the curtain rose, right? So. No, it was a pleasure for me. I didn't feel the embarrassment that I sometimes feel watching, Hitchcock's lesser works.
Knowing that Hitchcock was coming off a series of masterpieces in the 40s, like Shadow of a Doubt, like Notorious, like Foreign Correspondent, he had his right to his transitional phase, I think, and he made a few films that were highly experimental for their time. Here he experimented also with coming back to the Britishness of his films and the setting. So I think, yes, I like this movie more after our conversation because I think it really expanded my view. I think it's a fun film. You should definitely check it out. And it's right on the cusp of a really wonderful decade. Recently we saw Rear Window together here in Warsaw at the special screening. And even this first shot of Stage Fright with curtain rising up will be repeated in Rear Window. So I think the curtain rises not only on post-war London in Stage Fright, but really the curtain rises on a wonderful decade that's ahead, and Hitchcock will be adventurous, will be great in this decade. And one of the chief examples of that will be our next film that we will discuss, definitely one of the most fascinating films in Hitchcock era, and this will be Strangers on a Train.
Two fellows meet, like you and I. No connection between them whatsoever. Each one has somebody that he'd like to get rid of. So, they swap murders.
Fantastic, isn't it?
This will be on the next episode. Please follow us. We have a Facebook page. We have a YouTube channel. You can also subscribe there. You can subscribe on Spotify. This is a podcast that we really we put all our passion in it. Please follow. Please share the news with other Hitchcock fans. And we will soon discuss Strangers on a Train. This was the 36th episode of Foreign Correspondence.
Deeper into Hitchcock.